Now, settlement houses, as you know, were institutions that were quite widespread in American cities around the turn of the century. Jane Addams in Chicago founded one of the very first, and they were places that brought to neighborhoods like the Lower East Side services of various kinds, childhood nutrition programs, baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults as well, because these were things which the tenements in cities like New York did not have. They had adult education classes in English language literacy and other subjects as well. Now, these settlement houses served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor, but the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates.
I'm Rachel King, the director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. The Jewish Heritage Center is an archive and educational center dedicated to exploring and preserving Jewish family, institutional, and community history. Our work is all about highlighting the stories and contributions of Jewish Americans. And so we are delighted to be partnering today with American Inspiration in bringing you this program about a fascinating Jewish American woman, Rose Pastor Stokes. An immigrant to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, Stokes had a uniquely American story. She was very famous and larger than life in her own time, but is practically unknown today. We are so pleased to host Adam Hochschild and his new book, Hot Off the Presses, which returns Stokes' important story to its rightful place in our history. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Adam Hochschild.
So Rose Pastor Stokes, who's at the center of this story, is a remarkable but today little-known woman. And this book is the story of her, and it's also the story of her marriage, which was, I think, one of the most unusual in recent American history, and which gives us a lens through which we can look at the country a century and a quarter ago, its hopes, its illusions, its enormous injustices. Let me talk about her story first. The woman who would become Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia in the town of Augustov, a small city that today is in the far northeast corner of Poland. But of course, in 1879, when she was born, there was no Poland, and it was part of the empire of the Tsar. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustov, or at least some of them, did not all live in a shtetl, because Rose's father, who was a shoemaker, lived above his cobbler's shop on this main square of the town. He and her mother separated very soon after her birth. Beginning in 1881, a series of pogroms shook Russia. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this, of course, was what ignited the enormous exodus of millions of Jews from the Russian Empire, going usually first to Western Europe, and then for most of them on to the United States. And among those who left was Rose, then 3 years old, and her mother. They stayed first for 7 years in London, living in great poverty in the city's East End. And there, Rose had the only formal schooling she ever had, less than 2 years. But it was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write English and to acquire a lifelong love of English poetry. Because at home, of course, she spoke Yiddish. Then when she was 11 years old, in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States, like so many millions of other people, on a packed immigrant ship like this one. They went to Cleveland, Ohio, where her mother's second husband had preceded them. But as soon as they got there, Rose immediately had to go to work at the age of 11 in a factory that made cigars. This is the first photograph that shows her. She's in that back row, the middle of the back row here. The photograph was taken in 1896. She's 16 years old. She worked as a cigar factory worker for a dozen years. And by the end of that time, she was the sole support for herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. She worked both days and sometimes in the evenings as well, earned a total of $8 a week, the equivalent of about $240 today. And rolling cigars was difficult work. The oil from the tobacco leaves seeped into your skin, into your clothes. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. And in these cigar factories, the air had to be kept humid. Otherwise, the leaves would crack and you couldn't use them to roll around the cigar. That meant that windows were nailed shut in the summertime so that breeze wouldn't blow the humidity out. Very fine tobacco dust filled the air, and it filled workers' lungs as well. Cigar workers had the second highest rate of tuberculosis of any occupation in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. And Rose would have lung problems as long as she lived. When she was 21 years old, something happened. She saw something that would change her life. It was a copy of a Yiddish newspaper published in New York. The Yiddish is Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. The paper was based in New York, but was trying to go national. It ran one page in English, and on that page, it asked readers around the country, wherever they were, to send in stories, anecdotes, letters about their lives, whatever they could contribute. Rose immediately started sending things to the newspaper and was amazed when she actually got a check for $2 in the mail and realized she could be paid for writing. They gave her a column under the heading of Just Between Ourselves Girls, an advice column for women, which she wrote under the pen name of Zelda. And she was even more amazed and delighted when, after writing for the paper from Cleveland for 2 years, they invited her to New York to work for the paper full-time for the newspaper's English page in New York City at double the salary of what she was making as a cigar worker. She arrived in New York in 1903, 23 years old, and just imagine how amazing that city looked to somebody who was seeing it for the first time. Enormous skyscrapers like none she'd ever seen before, steam-powered elevated trains like the one in this picture running on tracks above the street, trolleys propelled by underground cables on the streets themselves. Beneath the streets, thousands of people at work building a giant subway system that hadn't opened yet, and on the streets a few of the new horseless carriages. She lived and worked on the Lower East Side, and this, of course, was the principal Jewish district of New York. And New York at that time is a city that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was full of immigrants. More than half the men in Manhattan over 21 years old were foreign-born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world, thanks to all this immigration. It was already the largest Jewish city in the world. As a reporter for the paper based on the Lower East Side, Rose spent most of her time interviewing people like these pushcart peddlers, people who worked in the shops, kosher butcher shops and so forth there. But one day in the summer of 1903, when she'd been at the newspaper in New York for about 6 months, the editor gave her a different kind of assignment. He sent her to interview someone who worked in a nearby settlement house. Now, settlement houses, as you know, were institutions that were quite widespread in American cities around the turn of the century. Jane Addams in Chicago founded one of the very first. And they were places that brought to neighborhoods like the Lower East Side services of various kinds, childhood nutrition programs, baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults as well, because these were things which the tenements in cities like New York did not have. They had adult education classes in English language literacy and other subjects as well. Now, these settlement houses served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor, but the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. The settlement house where Rose was sent to do her interview, still there today, is called the University Settlement on the Lower East Side. And here is the man she was asked to interview, James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. And as you can tell by the name, he was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he and Rose fell in love. He came from the most different kind of family background imaginable. Here, for example, is his family's summer home, which they referred to as their cottage in the Berkshires near Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And in fact, it was one of several homes the family had. At the time it was built in the 1890s, it was the largest private home in the United States. It had 100 rooms, and legend has it that one of Graham Stokes's brothers, who was in the class of 1896 at Yale, sent his mother a telegram saying, bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and his mother replied, many guests already here have room for only 50. Here are Graham Stokes's parents, each of whom came to their marriage with a substantial fortune, which they combined. The family's wealth rested in part on the Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation, on New York real estate, especially luxury apartment housing on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and on a cluster of gold and silver mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them, and more. Here are Graham's parents with their 9 children and some of the spouses and offspring of those children. This was a family where the boys were expected to play prominent roles in life, and they did. One of them became a famous architect. One of them became an editorial writer for the New York Times. One of them became what today would be called provost at Yale University, later dean of the National Cathedral in Washington. A grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls, of course, at that time were not expected to have careers, but to marry well. And the women of this family did so. One married a nobleman and became a baroness. Another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. Graham Stokes, however, took a somewhat different path in life than his siblings. After graduating from Yale, he went to medical school at Columbia. And it was while working as a medical student on a horse-drawn ambulance that he was exposed to a very different New York than the city he'd grown up in. It was the New York of the tenements, and Graham Stokes was very much shocked by what he saw. Apartments where immigrants were living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a small room. Tenements where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. He was outraged by what he saw, and this is what led him to become part of the settlement house movement. And like many volunteers who were part of that movement, he actually went to live in a settlement house on one of the upper floors of the university settlement that we saw a photo of just now. And that, of course, is where Rose met him for the first time. They courted secretly for 2 years, and then the news leaked out, probably because a newspaper reporter had bribed a telegraph operator to report any items of interest that came over the wires. And when the news came out, it was literally front page. This is the story on the front page of the New York Times. J.G. Phelps Stokes to wed young Jewess. It received immense attention. Newspapers across the country, in Europe, in Australia, everybody was fascinated by this story. Here it is as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, what attracted people's attention was not just that it was a marriage between someone extremely rich and someone extremely poor, but it was interethnic, Jew and Gentile, something extremely unusual at that time. Finally, despite the well-concealed dismay of Graham's family, they got married on July 18, 1905. It was Rose's 26th birthday. Graham Stokes was 7 years older than she was. The press remained fascinated by them, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for two decades to come. And the core of the public's fascination, of course, was that here seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming in his castle comes and rescues poor Cinderella from her humble hearth, promises her a better life, brings her to live in his castle. What is it that fascinates us and has for centuries about Cinderella-like stories? I think it's because we read them, we listen to them with some sort of hope of transformation for the people involved. We hope that this new love will conquer all differences, that Prince Charming will be softened by the woman he's fallen in love with, that she'll be uplifted and flourish in the castle in a way that she couldn't have in the hut that she came from. So the public continued to watch them very carefully to see just what would happen. Here is a photo of Rose taken the year after they married. However, their lives did not fit the Cinderella script, for Graham, to some degree, had left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one. They did often stay with his parents in one or another of their homes, but it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived the way Graham's family did, others were desperately poor, and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best solution to the injustices of the United States at that time, the Socialist Party. The party's leader was Eugene V. Debs, enormously beloved, popular figure, 5 times candidate for president. He had begun his working life as a railway worker and then as head of the Railway Workers Union. And when in 1908 he campaigned for president, it was on a special train crisscrossing the country called the Red Special that had red flags flying, draped in red bunting. And of course, when engineers on adjoining tracks recognized the Red Special coming past, they blew long blasts on their whistle. Debs came to New York in 1908 in that presidential campaign, was received by an enormous crowd at Grand Central Station. And when he was on the platform in New York, Graham Stokes was with him because Graham was running as a socialist candidate from the Lower East Side for the New York State Legislature. Rose went out and campaigned for both of them. Neither Debs nor Graham Stokes won the election, but people still remained fascinated by this couple. Everyone still saw it as the Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired 2 novels. Here's one of them, which was Salome of the Tenements, which was later turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film, like so many films from that era, was lost, but we still have promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. Here's one. I have no idea what they're saying to each other in this picture. Your guess is as good as mine, because we can't go look at the film to check. Now, this was a time when even for people not living in poverty, many, many people in this country were becoming aware of the enormous disparities of wealth and injustices in American life. One of the episodes that did that involved clothing workers in New York City. Workers who were working in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company at the top floor, the second floor from the top of this building just off Washington Square in New York. A terrible fire broke out. The workers were trapped. Most of them were unable to get out. There was an inadequate fire escape which collapsed from the weight of the people trying to go down it. The door to a stairwell, which would have allowed people to escape the flames, was locked. They couldn't get out, locked to keep union organizers out. 146 people were burned to death or leapt out the window to escape the flames and died on the sidewalk below. Of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. It was something that riveted the country. 300,000 New Yorkers turned out to watch the funeral procession for those who were killed. Rose continued her journalism, but it was now issues of labor and social justice that she was mostly writing about. Also, women's rights issues. She got involved with one case that has echoes of the kind of battles that are still going on in the Me Too era today. It involved a woman named Sarah Cohen, also an immigrant from Russia, who worked as a nurse and worked for a doctor whose home and office were in the same building on the Upper East Side in New York. And he gave Sarah Cohen a room to live in his combination home office. One night when she was asleep, he piped chloroform under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. Sometime later, she realized she was pregnant. She got a gun. She shot and killed the doctor and surrendered to the police. Rose immediately went to the prison where she was being held, interviewed her at length in Yiddish, told a much longer story about what had happened than anyone else had written up to that point. And she announced publicly that she would pay Sarah Cohen's legal expenses, and once she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to stay. The trial was delayed until Sarah Cohen gave birth in prison, and then she was found not guilty, in part because another woman came forward to testify that she had been assaulted by the same doctor. 3 or 4 years after Rose and Graham married, the United States began a decade or more when the country was convulsed by strikes, with hundreds of thousands of workers walking out every year. And this was a time when labor unions had almost none of the rights which they later acquired. The strikes were often suppressed by police. That's the Chicago police arresting a striking garment worker, or by troops. These are Massachusetts state militia putting down the strike that took place in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a famous mill workers strike, which was organized by the IWW, the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, who played a major role in a number of the labor confrontations of this era. One big strike that took place was of garment workers in New York City. And if you're close enough, which you may not be, to read the signs, you'll notice that these signs held up by striking garment workers are in English, Yiddish, Russian, and Italian. Rose got heavily involved in this strike, speaking to groups of strikers, often many times each day, to try to keep their spirits up. And it was really in that strike that she first came into her own as an organizer and was an immensely popular speaker, talking in English or Yiddish as the occasion required, and she soon became recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time. And the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories now were more about her than about the two of them as a couple. And there's signs that her husband was not happy about this. The most interesting strike that Rose got involved in took place in 1912, and it was a strike of hotel and restaurant workers in New York City. Wobbly organizers walked into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another, usually as lunch or dinner was about to be served, blew a whistle, and the waiters walked out. They did this at the Waldorf Astoria, Delmonico's, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, and dozens of other restaurants. And that immediately put it on the front pages. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking waiters. She helped handle publicity for the union. She wrote about the miserable conditions in which they worked. And in her papers, there are many, many letters of thanks from waiters who took part in this strike. Now, one of the objects of the strike was the largest hotel in New York City, the Ansonia Hotel. And if any of you are New Yorkers, you may recognize the building because it's still there between 73rd and 74th Streets on Broadway as an apartment house. There were several dining rooms and restaurants in the hotel. It was a famous gathering place for musicians, show business people, and mobsters. And its owner was Graham Stokes' uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. A colorful character, a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much more. And he was absolutely furious that his nephew's wife, his own nephew's wife, was agitating for his own workers to walk out, and he exploded in anger at Rose. And you'll see he later comes back into the story in a different way. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose's and Graham's lives. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew or worked with some of the most interesting people in the United States at that time. Big Bill Haywood, the dominant figure in the IWW, a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when necessary in a strike, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. John Reed, probably the finest journalist of his generation. W.E.B. Du Bois, greatest black intellectual of his time, and maybe of any time in the United States. Mary Harris Jones, or Mother Jones, the great labor organizer. Rose and Graham knew all of these people. Some of them were their house guests. Upton Sinclair, to whose novel The Jungle we owe our pure food and drug laws, as he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham Stokes for his comments. Margaret Sanger, the birth control pioneer, in the center in this picture in her Brooklyn clinic. We take birth control for granted today, but shortly after this photo was taken, police shut down the clinic and Sanger was sent to jail. Rose was active in the campaign for birth control, talking about it repeatedly, even when doing so was then against the law. Another of their friends, often in jail, and this is a mugshot taken on one of those occasions, was Emma Goldman, the anarchist firebrand. All of these were people that Rose and Graham knew and worked with, and several of them left us their recollections of the couple. Emma Goldman, for instance, who was always very blunt, thought Graham was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose could put up with him. The period of American life when all of these people were active, and I'm really thinking of like 1900 to 1914 or so, was a remarkable time. It was an optimistic time. It was a time when these folks and millions more believed that the world could be changed and a new and more just society was somehow just around the corner. Sadly, though, something happened that put an end to that period of great confidence and optimism, the First World War. And this war not only, it shattered innumerable lives, not only killing more than 9 million soldiers and an even greater number of civilians, but it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never fight each other. The United States, though, did not join the war when it started, and American socialists and other radicals agitated very strongly for the US to stay out of the fighting. Rose, Emma Goldman, and many of their friends joined something called the Women's Peace Party, which staged demonstrations like this one. But several years after the war began, in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. And soon after that, American troops were on their way to Europe, eventually there by the millions, and by the middle of 1918 were playing a major role in the fighting. Here at home, there was a ferocious barrage of propaganda from the government. The country was swept by war fever, and the government essentially did its best to silence anybody who spoke out against American participation in the war. The war caused a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the United States to join the fighting, and she began traveling the country saying this very loudly. He was so enthusiastic about the war that he actually enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but served in the New York National Guard for several years, never got closer to combat than marching down Fifth Avenue in a parade. Something else that divided Rose and Graham happened in late 1917, the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia, the second stage of the Russian Revolution. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. She continued speaking out against the war and now speaking in favor of the Russian Revolution as well. This drew the ire of many people, including Graham's uncle, the angry hotel owner. And here is a report about him from the files of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, urging the Bureau to come, giving them the address that Rose and Graham lived at in New York, and urging them to come and search the house because some valuable information could be secured. A couple of days later, he called the Bureau, told them that Rose and Graham were going to be out of town and that would be the best time to make a search, and they did so. And all of this stuff you can find in the government records today. The Bureau kept a close eye on Rose. Agents followed her. Government stenographers transcribed her speeches, which was very useful for me. And after one anti-war talk, she was arrested, put on trial under the Espionage Act, which was this act that was essentially sort of criminalized dissent against the war, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Graham put up bail money, they appealed the case, and several years later the sentence was overturned on appeal, so she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, the marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very, very uneasily, because they were going in radically different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party and actually went to Russia in 1922 for a meeting of the Communist International that was addressed actually both by Lenin and Trotsky. And like far too many people at that time and later, she thought that in Soviet Russia she had found paradise. Graham Stokes looked for paradise in a different direction. He abandoned all his involvement in progressive politics, became deeply interested in religion, and particularly in blending the traditions of Hinduism and Christianity. They got divorced very bitterly in 1925. This put them back on the front pages in a spectacular way, but for the last time, because as soon as they were no longer a couple, the public and the press completely lost interest in them. So, but despite that, happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary. They wrote dueling unpublished memoirs. Rose's was finally published 50 years after her death, and their friends left many recollections of them. So I had rich, rich material to work from in reconstructing their story. And please do historians a favor, save your letters. Many of them may end up in an institution like this one, where folks like me can come and look at them. And keep diaries, very important. After their divorce, Rose, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony, so she was reduced to poverty again. She remarried, but to someone who was as poor as she was. She soon came down with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. Graham also remarried, but didn't take a leap out of his class this time, married the daughter of a railroad executive, and he lived to the age of 88, dying in 1960. So that's their story, and I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but maybe through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing, and that still does today. And I hope you'll enjoy getting to know them as much as I did. So thank you very much.
A few questions. So I'm curious, we've heard about the Cinderella story, but she was really ahead of her time. She was an activist for labor, for reproductive rights. She was an anti-war activist, and certainly kept amazing company with all these other intellectuals and activists too. So why do you think that her story has been completely forgotten?
You know, it's always, is this on? Can you hear me okay? Well, all right.
We'll pass it back and forth.
Okay, I'll use this one then. It's always curious what makes somebody noticed and forgotten. Rose, Pastor Stokes, received an enormous amount of attention when she was alive. The proprietor of a newspaper clipping service, the nearest thing to a database at that time, did a count, and in the years 1918 to 21, which included her trial and 10-year prison sentence that finally was not served, during that period, she was the woman whose name was mentioned most often in the American press. There were 5 men, including people like Woodrow Wilson and Henry Ford, who were mentioned more often, but she was the woman's name that most appeared. And if you go to any database of old newspapers online today, like that wonderful one maintained by the Library of Congress, you'll find thousands of articles by her. Why did she get forgotten? I think part of it is that she marginalized herself by joining the Communist Party. And unlike her friend Emma Goldman, who also went to Russia but had the sense to realize that it was not turning into paradise, Rose never had that realization and remained a kind of true believer to the end of her life. She also didn't leave behind a big volume of writing, and I think that sort of enabled people to forget her. The autobiography that she wrote was unfinished, and as I said, it was only published more than about 50 years after her death. So those may explain, in part, why she got forgotten.
Well, we're grateful to you for returning her story to the historical record.
Although I'm not the only one who's written about her, so.
Well, I think we need her story in this time, so thank you. I also have to ask, how much of a role, if any, did her Jewish identity and background play into her
I think the answer is sort of yes and no on that. She grew up, of course, in an almost entirely Jewish milieu. First in Russia, then, in the Jewish ghetto in the East End of London, living in a similar Jewish ghetto in Cleveland, and then on the Lower East Side in New York. And of course, she worked for a Jewish newspaper. And in her columns, she tells her women readers, be sure to go to the synagogue regularly and to sit in the balcony, which was, the place where in some Orthodox synagogues it was set aside for women. But there's no record of her ever going to a synagogue herself. And I think she was not religious either in a religious sense or in a cultural sense. And as soon as she became a socialist, a year after she married Graham, they both joined the party, really socialism was her religion, and it kind of surpassed everything else. She similarly did not identify as a feminist, because all of these problems, whether it was women's rights, reproductive rights, anything else, it would all be solved when socialism came. So even though, she spoke about birth control and certainly supported the suffrage movement, she didn't really feel a member of that either.
She was very influential in her time and was also a product of her time. Who might you call the modern day Rose Pastor Stokes today? Who's her ancestor?
Or descendant, you mean?
Her descendant, yes, her descendant.
Gosh, I hope she has a lot of descendants. It's hard to think of a single person, and I'm sure, 20 minutes from now, I'll think of exactly the right example. It's hard to think of a single person who has sort of leapt worlds the way she does, and the way she has coming. I don't know, I think maybe the closest would be some of the women in the Muslim world who have spoken out. Hirsan Ali, is that her name? What's the name of the young woman in Pakistan? Malika? You know who I'm talking about. I think in terms of people who made a cultural leap from a very repressive society into speaking out about the injustices that they saw there, some of those folks might be the most comparable.
But did she have any actual descendants?
No, Rose and Graham did not have children. They each had a lot of collateral descendants because they each came from large families. So there were a lot of nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nephews, actually a number of whom came to hear me talk about the book last night in Washington, D.C., a number of people from the Stokes family. And I was delighted to see them. And I just got an email from another Stokes today. So I'm waiting to hear from the pastors.
You used the phrase, well-concealed, what was her
Well-concealed dismay of Graham's family.
Well-concealed dismay. So how well-concealed was it?
Well, you see, that's the advantage of having a great repository of letters like the ones in this building. I just was shown the cartons of old letters and stuff upstairs. Graham Stokes' brother saved 240 boxes of papers, which he donated to the Yale University archives. And these things had been in storage for years. I had to retrieve them from storage for me. But there you can find letters between him and his mother saying, what about this girl that our beloved Graham is marrying? She's a Russian Jew, a cigar worker. What do we think about all this? And then he's trying to reassure. He then met Rose. Graham's parents were away in Europe when the news broke of the engagement, which hadn't been planned. The releasing the information to the press hadn't been planned. And it got into the European papers too. So the parents started writing the brother saying, what's going on here? And then the brother wrote back and said, well, I've met her and she's really very nice and she doesn't look all that Jewish. So.
The dueling sets of memoirs, because I've worked on a project at one point involving Alva Belmont, and she wrote 2 memoirs, incomplete, and they are dueling between the 2, and a lot of times it's hard to trust what she's saying or her co-author is saying about motivations. So did you have any fears on that score?
Of course, you should never completely trust a memoir. And I say that having written one myself. Because people always remember things selectively, and they remember things that tend to make themselves look good, and so forth. The interesting thing about Graham's unpublished memoir is that it's, I think, 256 typewritten pages. It describes his travels as a young man. It describes a lot about his family background. It describes briefly his time in the settlement house movement and the Socialist Party, and it never mentions Rose, to whom he was married for 20 years. Rose's memoir is much more honest and more interesting, more subtle, because she talks about, even though their marriage ended in flames, she talks about how and why she was attracted to him initially. She skips over a few things. For example, they had a remarkable house on an island off the coast of Connecticut, of Stamford, Connecticut. And in fact, that's where a number of these other folks were their house guests. And we know from Rose's letters at the time that she was really very fond of that house and of this beautiful island, which Graham's mother had given to them as a wedding present. So we know she felt that way at the time. But when she wrote her memoirs, she was a Communist Party member, and it was certainly not proper to admit, a liking for anything as luxurious as this bourgeois island home. So that's what's omitted from her memoir. But hers is a much more interesting book and well worth reading, and I wish she had lived long enough to finish it.
From an immigrant girl who grew up in Poland and went to a cigar factory at age 11, became a recognized writer. What was her education? How is it that she developed as an accomplished public figure?
You wonder about that, and you feel a little jealous and envious, and did I really have to go to college at all? I think a couple of things. We know she had 2 years of schooling in London, which she writes about very warmly, and that's where she got her love of poetry. Her mother then had to pull her out of school because she was needed to work at home. And her mother certainly was literate, and Rose talks about the mother reading aloud Yiddish poetry to them. And Rose later translated or co-translated a book of Yiddish poetry. But she was always a big reader. One advantage of being a cigar worker is that if you're good at it, your hands can do the work, and you can have a book propped up in front of you and do some reading, at least in short snatches, while you are making the cigar. And she did that and talks about that. During the time that she was living in Cleveland, up until the age of 23, she belonged to a sort of a Jewish fraternal society that had cultural activities and so forth, and I found their newspaper, and they talk about her reciting poetry at its meetings and so forth. So I think the real answer is be a big reader. And that's something I wish on lots of people today, including my grandchildren who are glued to their phones all the time.
Well, as someone heading up the American Inspiration Author Series, I have to end on that note because I think it's so wonderful, the thought of all of us reading for education. And Adam, thank you you so much for being here today. We're very grateful for you sharing this tremendous book with us and the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center. So again, thank you, and thank you all for coming. Another round of applause.
Thank you.